I spent my whole life studying God, but I never expected truth to walk quietly into my chest and change everything. My name is Dr. Alexis Romano. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Florence, Italy, and for most of my life, I was a university professor in theology and philosophy. My world was built out of texts, ideas, ancient languages, and debates that never seemed to end. I never imagined that after decades of studying faith from a distance, I would step into it with my whole being. I grew up in a small apartment above a bakery, the kind that fills the hallway with the smell of fresh bread at dawn. My family belonged to another faith tradition, one that shaped my childhood in ways I did not fully understand until much later. I was the quiet child who sat in the corner of the sanctuary and tried to make sense of the stained glass stories. My mother used to say that I was born with too many questions. I remember being 8 years old, tugging at her sleeve and asking why some prayers felt like poetry and others felt like locked doors. She would smile and tell me to focus on being a good boy, but inside me something kept turning. I wanted to know who God really was, not only who people said he was. As I got older, I buried myself in books. Plato, Augustine, Aquinas, Rumi. Anyone who had ever tried to understand the nature of existence became my companion. My life felt like a long staircase made of pages. Every time I climbed, the view changed, but the summit always looked far away. By the time I turned 20, I was certain that my future would be shaped by study. Faith was an academic interest, not a home. I analyzed belief the way a scientist examines a specimen. I never thought it would ask for anything from me. Look, the truth is that a life built only on intellect becomes strangely hollow. I used to walk through the corridors of the university with a stack of books under my arm, nodding politely at colleagues, discussing metaphysics and ontology as if these ideas actually held me together. But inside, I felt a kind of quiet collapse happening. To be honest, theology had become a field where nothing was sacred anymore. We dissected faith with surgical tools, pulling it apart layer by layer until nothing living was left in our hands. I taught about God without feeling God. I explained doctrines without believing them. I started calling it the paper version of truth because everything felt flat. There were days I would stand in front of a classroom full of students and talk about the nature of revelation, and then I would go back to my office, close the door, and feel completely numb. Something was missing, and I had no vocabulary for it. The deeper I went into academia, the more I felt myself drifting away from the simple, sincere wonder I once had as a child, staring at stained glass. I became an expert in analysis, but a stranger to meaning. Ask yourself why that mattered so much. Because somewhere along the way, I realized that if God was real, then surely his truth could not be reduced to arguments or footnotes. Surely faith had to be more than intellectual gymnastics. And every night, when the campus grew quiet, I would sit at my desk, surrounded by books, and wonder why all my knowledge left me feeling spiritually starved. The more I studied, the more contradictions I saw in the worldview I had inherited, and that created a kind of ache in me, a slow burn. I was searching desperately for something coherent, something whole, something that did not force me to choose between heart and mind. This is where everything changed for me. It started with a single sentence in a manuscript I was reviewing. A colleague had written about the historical development of scriptural texts, and buried in the footnotes was a reference to Islamic preservation. I remember pausing, rereading it, feeling this strange pull. I had studied every major world religion except Islam with any real depth. That realization startled me. So one evening, almost casually, I downloaded an English translation of the Quran. I told myself I was reading it for professional completeness, nothing more. But the moment I opened it, something shifted inside me, like a locked door quietly clicking open. The language was unlike anything I had encountered. It felt alive, direct, unfiltered. It did not argue. It declared. It did not attempt to persuade. It simply told the truth and left you standing in front of it. I remember the night I read a verse speaking about how God is nearer to us than our own jugular vein. I put the book down and just stared at the wall. I had spent years studying philosophies that danced around the idea of transcendence, but here was a text that spoke of intimacy with the Creator so plainly that it almost frightened me. That was the beginning. From there, I fell into months of private research. I cross-referenced manuscripts, read classical tafsir, studied prophetic biography. I found a consistency that startled me. No fractured councils, no political edits, no theological acrobatics. And then came the moment that changed the course of my life entirely. A Muslim colleague invited me to visit a local Islamic center just to see Islam lived, not only read. Those were his words. I went reluctantly. I stood in the back of the prayer hall and watched dozens of men and women bow their heads in unison. No choir, no hierarchy, no performance, just pure surrender. In that moment, something inside me whispered, This, this is what you have been searching for. The strange thing is that the more I studied Islam academically, the more it felt like a mirror being held up to my own heart. Every concept I had wrestled with for years found clarity. Divine unity, justice, mercy, purpose, the human condition. Nothing felt forced, nothing felt irrational. It was as if the answers had been waiting for me, patiently, while I circled them from every angle except the right one. But look, submitting to truth is never easy, especially when it asks you to step out of the life you built. I was a professor in a field where conversion was almost unthinkable. It threatened my reputation, my relationships, even my identity. One night, after months of study, I found myself sitting alone in my apartment. The Quran was open on the table. I stared at the words, and I knew. My heart knew long before my intellect admitted it. Islam was the truth I had been chasing my entire life. I felt this overwhelming mixture of fear and peace. I understood that accepting Islam meant surrender, but it also meant alignment. Finally aligning the inner and outer world that had been at war inside me. So when I walked into the Islamic center the next morning, my hands were shaking. An elderly imam greeted me with a gentle smile. He asked nothing of me. He did not pressure me. He simply said, "When your heart is ready, God is ready." Those words broke something open inside me. Minutes later, with a quiet voice and tears sliding down my face, I said the Shahada. There were no trumpets, no drama, only a stillness so profound I can still feel it when I close my eyes. It felt like stepping out of a long, dark corridor and finally standing in sunlight. Life after embracing Islam did not become easier, but it became real. I had to navigate conversations with colleagues who looked at me with suspicion, as if I had betrayed the academic tribe. Some asked if I had been influenced. Others suggested I was going through a midlife crisis. They could analyze every theory except sincerity. My family's reaction was a mixture of confusion and fear. They worried I was joining something foreign, something they could not understand. So I learned patience. I learned silence. I learned that guidance cannot be forced. But the transformations inside me were undeniable. For the first time in my life, belief and understanding were not fighting each other. My prayers were no longer intellectual exercises. They were grounding moments that brought my heart back to center. And the discipline of Islam reshaped me. Waking before dawn, washing before prayer, eating consciously, speaking carefully. All these small acts rewired the architecture of my soul. To be honest, I struggled at times. My academic training wanted control, certainty, constant analysis. Islam asked me to balance reason with humility. It taught me that knowing God is not the same as knowing about God. What surprised me most was how Islam softened me. I used to be proud of my ability to debate, to win arguments, to outthink anyone in the room. But Islam taught me the beauty of gentleness, of listening, of letting truth speak for itself. 12 years later, I am still learning, still growing, still unlearning parts of my old self that no longer fit. If I could speak to anyone searching the way I once searched, I would say this. Look for truth with your whole heart, not only with your intellect. Knowledge can guide you, but it cannot carry you. At some point, you have to step into the water yourself. Do not be afraid of what you might lose. What you gain is far greater. Faith does not erase who you are, it completes who you were always meant to be. Ask yourself who you become in the presence of God. Ask yourself why that matters so much. And if you feel a quiet pull toward Islam, do not ignore it. Follow it gently. Let it unfold. Truth rarely shouts, it usually whispers. And lastly, be patient with yourself. Transformation is slow, but every sincere step is seen. Every doubt, every fear, every tear, all of it counts. All of it is held. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope, in some small way, it brings you a little closer to the peace I finally found.